Welcome, everybody. We'd like to thank the Atlanta Historical Society Center and Kate Whitman, who put this all together, and Fox. And you see, here I go. See, Fiona, I told you, Foxtail Books. I'm so bad at reading on the screen, and Foxtail Books. And also, before we start and I introduce everybody, I'd like to remind everybody in the audience that independent bookstores are our lifeblood, and we need them desperately, and they're hurting terribly because of COVID. And so if you really can manage to buy a book tonight from Foxtails, we would really appreciate it. If not for you, buy a book for a friend, buy a Christmas present or a Hanukkah present. Just please help support your independent bookstores, because without them, we don't know what we would do. So with no further ado, and I'll probably push that again later on, with no further ado.
I was thinking, MJ, we should mention that the link to buy the book from Foxtail is in the chat box.
Yes, it's right there.
So you can buy as many copies as you feel like. And if anyone has questions as we go through, start putting them in the chat box, and we will check those and answer them once we've done chatting.
Yes, we're going to chat for about 20 minutes and then start asking you guys, answering the questions that you guys are asking. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. I'm MJ Rose, and I'm an author of about 20 novels, and I'm not going to go through my bio because I'm doing the intros and that's awkward, but I write historical fiction, and I also run AuthorBuzz, which is the first marketing company for authors. And I'm going to go right into Chris Bohjalian is the #1 New York Times. I just want you all to know that my dog just started humping my leg. So I have to bend down and pick her up because that's absolutely not allowed. Chris Bohjalian is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 21 books. His work has been translated into 35 languages and 3 times have become movies. He's also a playwright and a screenwriter, and his novel, The Flight Attendant, is now an HBO Max limited series starring Kaylee, I don't know how to pronounce this, Cuoco. Fiona Davis, my co-editor, is the USA Today and New York Times bestselling author of historical fiction set in iconic New York City buildings, including her most recent, The Lions of Fifth Avenue. Her books have appeared on the Indie Next list, been Library Reads Picks, and the Skim Reads Pick of the Week, and have been translated into over a dozen languages. Alyson Richman is the #1 international best-selling author of 7 novels, including The Velvet Hours and The Lost Wife, which is currently in development for a major motion picture. Her books have been translated into 20 languages and have reached the bestseller charts in several countries. And I'm going to skip over me. And no, my last book was Cartier's Hope.
Which is
fantastic. My next book, what?
It's fantastic.
Oh, thank you. And we're going to go right into talking about this anthology. So I thought first I would just tell everybody a little bit about how this started. Chris is great. You just keep doing that. I hope you have lots of props. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this started, and then Fiona, please will just jump in as I describe our crazy trip. So 2 years ago, almost to the month, Fiona and I were invited to Minneapolis, Minnesota, to do a literary event with Pamela Klinger-Horn. And there was a windstorm the day we were leaving, and we were told by everybody to get to the airport 3 hours early. There's not a lot to do in the airport 3 hours early. So Fiona and I started talking about suffragettes and the suffragette movement and 2 historical fiction authors in an airport for 3 hours. We started talking about doing an anthology, and I even called Alyson while we were there to find out information about the one she had just done, because we had a similar idea. She had just done one called Grand Central, where all the writers wrote about a specific event in Grand Central Station as everybody went through the station. And Fiona and I were thinking that it would be really fun to do all the stories that take place in the same day in New York during the largest suffragette parade New York had ever seen, which was in 1915. And so by the time we got on the plane, we had the idea. We spent the whole plane ride sitting completely far away from each other, but texting each other, got off the plane. On the way to baggage, Fiona said, I think I know what the title should be, Suffragette City, at which point I screamed, which is not a smart thing to do in LaGuardia Airport because guards and everybody else think it's a terrorist attack. We had to say, no, it's a great book title. We got baggage, went back. We spent the weekend emailing each other the proposal, got it to our agents like 4 days later. Our agents made a few changes, started sending it out. And literally a week after they sent it out, we'd sold it to James Malia at Holt. And somewhere in there, we wrote to a few authors and asked them if they wanted to be part of it because the proposal actually had everybody's name in it. I just had to pick up the dog. Everybody, this is Fuzzle. She doesn't like me talking unless she can be part of the action. She makes me more human, so she'll probably sit on my lap for some of this. So all the authors that we approached said yes right away. We had a list of 50 authors and we never got through everybody because every single author we went to first, including these wonderful authors with us today, said yes. So that's how this happened. And Fiona, do you want to talk a little bit about how exciting it was to come up with the idea and how we felt about the suffrage movement?
Yeah, it was really, what we thought was, what if we base this book of short stories around October 23rd, 1915, when there was, as you said, this enormous suffragette parade up Fifth Avenue. And, it was an incredible parade. There were about 25,000 participants. And we reached out to all these authors and and I just want to say them all so we get their names out there. Lisa Wingate, MJ Rose, Steve Berry, Paula McLean, Catherine J. Chen, Christina Baker Klein, Jamie Ford, Dolan Perkins Valdez, Megan Chance, Alyson Richman, Chris Bohjalian, Fiona Davis, and an introduction by Kristen Hanna. And what we ended up with was this incredible mix of stories. Some are about fictional people, some are about real people. They're from all different perspectives. So you have, wealthy women, you have very poor immigrants, you have Armenians, you have Chinese, you have Irish people. And so it just became a reflection of New York City at that time. And what we found so interesting is now it's being released right before the election. It really is a microcosm of not only 1915, but also today, where there's just all these perspectives and things are changing and people are ready to march in the streets.
Thank you. So I thought I would ask Alyson first and then Chris. When we called and asked you to be part of this, what was your first reaction and why did you decide to say yes?
Oh, well, I was just so thrilled and excited when you called. I mean, the energy that you sort of communicated over the phone for the project was palpable. And, right away, I was thrilled to latch on to a creative project where one could channel the urgency of voting for the upcoming election. Also weaving together like all these incredible people that I knew that were going to be on your list. To be part of that was really thrilling. And, when you hear the word suffragette, especially for me as a woman, it just immediately, sends a spark through your body to know that the women before you who were fighting for the 19th Amendment, were trailblazers in their time. So to be able to sort of go back in history and to try and conjure up a character that I was going to write about for this was really exciting. And, immediately I wanted to pull from my own family's roots. My family on my mother's side came over in the early 1860s. So I knew that there were women on my mother's side that would have been in New York at the time of the parade. And so for my character, Emma Kling, that I wrote about, I actually used one of the family names and a woman named Emma Kling, who I had known had been someone who studied art at that time and who had probably gone to the Art Students League. So right away, as soon as you said it, I was like, I want to write about someone, from my family's Hungarian background, who were in New York, who were immigrants. I love writing about art. So it just was this great chance to sort of fuse, this idea of a trailblazer from the past, making it relevant in today's time. And again, like who would have thought that it would come out, the week before the 2020 election? It's incredible.
And Chris, What did you think when we asked? Why did you decide to say yes?
First of all, I was utterly gobsmacked and grateful, MJ, when you called. And I love the idea. And the first thing I thought of when you called was the Women's March in January of 2016. That was the first parallel that came to mind. We are in a moment, and it was clear from the moment you called, MJ, of acute social reckoning. And what a great idea for a book to look at 1915 and those magnificent women who marched up Fifth Avenue and put them together in a story collection. And one of the things I loved about the finished product, because it's just great, all of the stories are great. I loved your story, Alyson. I loved your story, Fiona. I loved your story, MJ.
Isn't he nice, everybody? He's just the nicest person.
I mean, I love the way that, for example, this little girl named Grace, my daughter happens to be named Grace.
We did that on purpose.
Weaves her way, weaves her way through some of these stories because it gets at the intergenerational nature. This autumn, we can never take for granted how hard women worked to get the right to vote, how hard people of color worked to get the right to vote. So when you called me and said, "Are you interested?" my reflex was, "Hell yeah."
Yeah, we should tell everybody a little bit about Grace, Fiona.
Yeah.
I'll start, but we had this idea that it would be more interesting if we had a character who continued through the book that each writer could choose to include or not. So in my story, which is the second story in the book, I introduce a little girl named Grace, who's the niece of my two characters, Katrina Tiffany and Charles Tiffany, who, by the way, are the same Tiffany as the store. Charles Tiffany was the son of Louis Comfort Tiffany, and Katrina Tiffany was a major suffragette, and her husband Charles was completely against the suffrage movement. And Grace is their imagined niece who wants to go to the parade desperately, and Katrina wants to take her, and Charles doesn't want her to go, and she winds up getting lost in my story. And for me, it was very thematic and metaphorical that this little girl gets lost at the parade, and that Fiona would find her at the end of the book, and that throughout the book, different authors would pick up on her and see her, spot her, talk to her. And we were really lucky that so many authors decided to include her a little bit in the story. Fiona, do you want to talk a little bit about your character and why you chose her? And then we'll actually ask Alyson and Chris to talk about their characters.
Yeah, sure. So I chose Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, and she was a society lady at that time, a really tough one. She was of New York high society and very, 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 very wealthy. And she became interested in the suffrage movement in 1909. She financed the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and she was just this PR maven, where when she decided she wanted to get behind the movement, it was no holds barred. And she had a huge mansion in Newport, which she opened up to the public for a fee in order to raise money for the suffrage movement, which was just unheard of, to allow regular people into your mansion, and just horrified her neighbors. She opened all these street front suffrage clubs and lunchrooms, but she was a real woman of contradictions because she was this, embodiment of old New York, but then was getting behind all these new ideas. And so for her, the parades were terrible. It was a terrible idea. Women should not march. It was unwomanly. She was furious when these parades started happening. And the first one, she pretended to be sick. In another one, she had her chauffeur drive her up the route. And I just thought that was an interesting point to jump into a character. And she did eventually march, and she called it a terrible ordeal, that it was very, very difficult for her. And so my story is about her making that decision to march. It's called, and she, has to get through a lot of her past and her history in order to do that. And of course, we have Grace weaving in and out, and they run into each other. And Alva and this little girl have a very interesting interaction.
one of the things about Alva that's so interesting in those lunchrooms when we were doing all the research is I saw there were plates and napkins and silverware and glasses and everything in the lunchrooms that she opened, which were for men and women, business people and workers. Everything was stamped with suffrage signage. You came to lunch at one of Alva's lunchrooms and you were inundated with the idea of getting women the vote. And it was such a modern idea to me that she in the early 1900s saw the marketing potential of the vote this way, and she connected it to restaurants. And it's not even it's like what's it called, the rock, what's the with the guitar, the restaurants,
Hard Rock
Well,
Cafe.
Hard Rock Cafe. She was the originator of a Hard Rock Cafe because it was a complete marketing idea and it was really brilliant.
Yes.
And one of the things about these women, Fiona and I are the two people that wrote about rich women. Everybody else wrote about very different kinds of women. At one point, our editor was kind of hysterical because he got our stories first, and he was like, "We can't just have rich white women in Manhattan." It's like, relax, calm down. It's just two rich white women in Manhattan, but they were very important because they were part of what was called the Mink Brigade. And if not for the Mink Brigade, there would have been no march because there needed to be people to support the march and pay for everything. And it was the rich white women in New York who made that happen. But they weren't always so fair and they weren't always so wonderful. And there were a lot of very sad things about that march. I mean, they didn't want Black women to march with them. They didn't want Jewish women to march with them or Irish women. And that was one of the reasons it was really important to us to have all the authors that we have in this anthology write about very different kinds of people. So maybe Alyson, you could talk a little bit more about your character, and then Chris about your character, because they really help widen the scope of the kind of people who were marching.
Right. Well, I mentioned a little bit before that my character was inspired by partly my own family background, that we were on my mother's side Hungarian immigrants that came over in the early 19th century. I immediately, when Fiona and MJ contacted me about writing something for the anthology, I knew I wanted to write about an artist and how an artist might be drawn into the suffragette movement. And so fusing this idea that I was going to make my character a young Hungarian immigrant, I wanted to also make her to be a aspiring artist. And so one of the things that I first realized in my research was that a fellow suffragette, a woman by the name of Ida Sedgwick Proper, who came from the Midwest and studied at the Art Students League, she started a poster campaign with a winning prize of $50 to the artist who would win that poster contest. And she advertised at the Art Students League for this contest. And $50 in 1915, I mean, $50 for, if I gave my children $50 at this point, they would think that was a pretty good prize money award. So I immediately, imagined my character being a young artist who sees this advertisement for a poster conference, a poster contest, is drawn into finding out more about it. And through these meetings at the Woman's Voter, which was a newspaper journal created by this artist, Ida Sedgwick Proper, she starts attending the meetings and learning more about the movement. And at the same time, she has this other life where she's trying to support herself because her parents are, not pleased that she doesn't want to get married and have a traditional life, that she wants to be an artist, and she's forced to pay her own bills in New York, and she's working at an ad agency. And so I sort of contrast this, very bold and ambitious young woman with the shackles that she has in her everyday life of trying to pay her way. And I don't want to give too much away about the plot, but in the ad agency, she definitely has her voice and her identity taken from her. And so as she's drawn into the suffrage movement, you see how this while she was, originally drawn into the money for the poster contest, it becomes something that is a seed that grows into her and makes her really want to, fight for the vote. So that's a little bit about my character.
And Chris?
First of all, Alyson's Emma is a great character. And I don't say that because A, former ad guy, B, grew up in Stamford, Connecticut, where Emma's family is from, in Alyson's remarkable short story. Okay, so my short story is called Just Politics. Just being a pun, is in merely politics or righteous politics. And it's about, well, it's 1915. And I'm an Armenian American. And so when I think of 1915, my mind goes first to the start of the Armenian genocide. The Ottoman Empire's systematic annihilation of 1.5 million Armenians, 300,000 Assyrians, and countless Greeks, and of course, the precedent for the Holocaust. So I decided to make my character an Armenian immigrant. Her name is Ani. Why is she in America in 1915? Well, in the run-up to the Armenian genocide were first the Hamidian massacres, and then the Adana massacre of 1909 when, and this number is mind-boggling, 30,000 Armenians were killed in a 4-week period. And so among the reasons why Armenians emigrated was the Hamidian massacres and the Adana massacres pre-1915. Ani gets involved with the suffragettes through the circuitous route of Red Cross pioneer Clara Barton, who had started the Boston-based Friends of Armenia to try to raise awareness in America for the massacres of the Armenians. And so for Ani's perspective, this is revolutionary. The idea of voting as a woman in the Ottoman Empire is, well, science fiction. But in America, it almost seems possible, just enough that she's willing to take the risk and be in this magnificent march with these other 24,999 women.
And it's such a powerful story. I love listening to you talk about it. Fiona, one of the questions everybody asks is that they all seem to be surprised that we have men in this anthology. So I thought that you could talk a little bit about what I thought was our very natural decision from day one to include men, but how did it play out and why did we make sure we had men in here?
Yeah, there were a lot of men who supported women's suffrage and formed groups, the Men's Suffrage League, I believe it was called. And so there were men who were very helpful in women, mobilizing and spreading the word about what they wanted. On the other hand, there were men who really did not want women to have a right to vote. In the parade in Washington in 1913, there was terrible violence against the women, and the police just stood by and watched, and 100 women were hospitalized. And so, it's a mix. And so we wanted to have, the input from the male side as well as the female, since it was a mixed group marching up Fifth Avenue.
So one of the things that a lot of people have also talked about is historical fiction in general, and with this anthology in particular. What is it that we gain by imagining ourselves and others back into these moments that are over 100 years ago? What do you hope readers will take away from the story today based on yesterday? So let's go through everybody again. Start with Alyson.
Well, what I always find so fascinating is that when you write historical fiction and you're looking back at research of the past, you're always trying to find at first all these details to make the world that you're creating come alive and make sure that it's historically accurate. But the actual themes that develop are universal. I mean, for example, the desire to protect your family, our yearning to love, to strive to break boundaries that maybe our mothers or fathers didn't have. And so those universal themes, I think, always connect the reader to realize that even if something happened a century ago, that they're still connecting emotions and desires that happen, that are timeless. And so for me, there's always that feeling of like wanting to learn those details that were happening at that world and those challenges. But then there's this like beauty that emerges, which is that, a character 100 years ago still had so many things in their life that I am still experiencing myself in this present time.
Chris, is there anything to add to that?
Sure. No, what Alyson said was brilliant.
Hardly.
One of my favorite quotes, E.M. Forrester. We all know that fiction is truer than history because it goes beyond the evidence. I'll repeat that. We all know that fiction is truer than history because it goes beyond the evidence. Fiction touches us in the heart, not just in the head. I mean, we were talking about the Armenian genocide a moment ago. When I wrote The Sandcastle Girls, which is a novel about the Armenian genocide, I could have written a history, I could have written a memoir, but the fact is, the reason Fiona and MJ and Alyson, why you write historical fiction, why I love historical fiction, is because of the way historical fiction touches us in a different and profound way.
It is. It's so amazing too that it seems like it's historical and it's very far away. And then there are moments where it's today. I've been talking a lot in these events about this piece of footage that's around the internet. You can Google it. It's a piece of film from New York in 1911, and somebody's redigitized it so that it's sped up to the right speed so that it doesn't look all choppy. And they've put some sounds behind it so you hear the horses and the cars. And there are things that are obviously different, but there are so many things that are the same. The Flatiron Building, the toy building, the bridges, the people walking around, while the men actually look amazingly. You could be right there now, Chris. I mean, men in ties and jackets. The only difference, you'd need a hat. Women look drastically different because they're still wearing big long dresses and hats. But you see the expressions on their faces and the way they hold their child's hand and the way two men look at each other and converse. And it's shocking how real it is. And we feel like it's obviously older, but it's not that much older. So I think that it would be, yes.
One thing, MJ, I think what I took away from the research was just how brave the women in 1915 were. And back then there was something called the New Woman. And that was the idea that women maybe should have financial independence and maybe should have careers. And they were meeting and forming groups and talking about birth control and the right to vote and women's rights. And there was this real sense of empowerment. And I think, it reminds me that we go through cycles, and we're in a cycle right now where women have to step up and be brave, just as the women in 1915 were. And so that's where, for me, historical fiction just resonates like crazy.
And you do it so well. Before I open this up to the audience for questions, I thought that you could each say just a little bit about either a book you're working on now or a book that's coming out in the near future. Fiona, you can start.
Yeah, sure. My book out right now is called The Lions of Fifth Avenue. It's set at the New York Public Library. And I'm working on a book that's set at the Frick Collection, which is a Gilded Age mansion on Fifth Avenue. And we'll see how it goes. It's still in dirty first draft form. But
it's going to be wonderful because they all are. And I also want to take this moment to remind everybody to buy all of our books and Suffragette City from Foxtail Bookshop. They all make great holiday gifts and book club choices. They're really rife with questions and things that your book club can discuss. And I hope you all take advantage. And Foxtail is a fan of all of ours, so they have all of our books there. We've all done events there, and it's a wonderful, wonderful bookstore.
Hi, Foxtail.
Chris, what's your current book or your next book that you want to plug?
Look, okay. Current book, The Red Lotus, set in, Alyson, you will love this, Vietnam. Next book, cover reveal, April 2021.
It's a beautiful cover.
Hour of the Witch, a novel about the first divorce in North America for domestic violence, 1662 Boston, which means that, of course, it devolved into a witch trial You will see Hour of the Witch, April 20, 2021.
I'm so impressed he's got his books
Yeah,
there at the ready. Like, I'm like, could I get up and go get my book? But I can't. It's too far away.
You got
Alyson,
in your lap. I can be a shameless and tawdry self-promoter. You've got to be a dog mom.
Alyson, what's your book out now?
Okay, well, I'm just wrapping up a book that's called The Minutes Home, and it's about a Vietnam veteran, a Vietnamese refugee, and an Irish immigrant, their three lives entwining against the backdrop of 1979, and how they each come into each other's life unexpectedly and help each other heal from trauma. So that's why I was in Vietnam for research, just like Chris. I know I saw on your Instagram that you were in Vietnam, I think 7 months before I was, but I can't wait to read your book.
And I can't wait to read. And I have to ask, were you on a bike tour, Alyson?
I wasn't on a bike tour because my character is a boat child. I wanted to be in the south of Vietnam and go by boat to see it by water. So I was on a very small, slow river boat that went partially, down the Mekong, and then we went into Saigon, and then I went, traveled to Cambodia. But I didn't bike, and I'm a terrible athlete. I get tired very quickly, so I would have been a terrible.
I just wondered because you're in CM Rep, so I was just wondering.
Okay. Yes, exactly.
MJ, why don't you tell us about your what you're working on?
So currently, what's out is Cartier's Hope, which actually takes place very much at the same time period as Suffragette City. And what's out next is coming in February, and it's called The Last Tiara. And it's a dual time story, takes place in 1917 in Russia, where a young woman is gifted a Fabergé tiara, and 1948, where that woman's daughter discovers that tiara, but it's been stripped of all its jewels, and she goes on a search to find out the truth about the tiara and her mother, and it goes back and forth between mother and daughter.
Wonderful.
So that's coming out in February. So are there any questions from the audience? I don't see any, but
Q&A. I have it open.
okay. Oh, I didn't. I only have a chat open. Okay, great. So I'll start asking the questions. So
because I think we've answered the first.
okay. Please comment about Ida B. Wells and what was President Wilson's reaction to the protests. Fiona, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. So one of the stories in the book centers on Ida B. Wells by Dolan Perkins Valdez. And what's interesting about it is that, of course, Black suffragists weren't welcome in many of the parades. And so she approached it in the way of having Ida B. Wells on the day of the parade in New York, reminiscing about the 1913 parade that she marched in Washington, where she was basically told to go to the back of the line and refused. And it's a wonderful story that really encapsulates the struggle of Black suffragists with this heartbreaking clarity. And yeah, it was a difficult time because the suffragists wanted to get the vote. They needed to get the politicians on their side. But the Southern politicians were not, interested in Black women voting. And so they started walking this very fine line that really was racist and unfortunate. And so, not everybody, it's not like everybody was on one side. There were all these factions fighting against each other.
The next question, I'm going out of order, but the next question was, from the time the authors said yes, how long was it until they turned in their stories? And as editors, did we set word count limits up front? So I'll answer that. So yes, we did set word count limits up front based on an overall word count for the whole book and how many authors we had, but we weren't very tough on everybody. It was anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 words, and everybody pretty much came in between those numbers. And how long we gave everybody almost a year. So there was we didn't want to rush anybody. That was part of the whole pitch in the beginning, why we started so early. So we asked people in September of 2018 if they wanted to be part of it, telling them the stories wouldn't be due till October of 2019, giving us till 2020 for it to come out. So everybody was on time, if not early. And Fiona and I, when we were talking to the different editors who wanted to publish the book, one of the things we told them all was they were going to have to be willing to do the editing, because Fiona and I were very in awe of the group of amazing authors who agreed to write for us. And there was no way either of us were going to write to those authors and say, you know, I think in paragraph 2, you really need to tell a little bit more of the character's backstory. We were not going to be the editors. So we were very lucky in that James Molina was perfectly happy to do the dirty work and write to everybody and say, okay, this is what I need from you. But as it turned out, because we saw all the edits, the stories were shockingly perfect when they were turned in. And the edits were really copy edits, you know, like a word left out here or there. There was almost no one who had to do any work on the story or her story. So it was really a seamless, amazing, the whole project's been like that from the very beginning, from the airport. Everything just kind of like happened. Which is not what's happened for the last 2 years in any way, in any other way. So it's kind of wonderful to have one thing going on during all this madness in our country that's gone smoothly. So I'm going to ask the next question to Alyson and then ask Chris the next question. So Alyson, what was the most eye-opening thing you discovered during your research for your story?
Question. Well, I don't know if it was eye-opening, but the thing that really surprised me the most was when I was looking at the black and white photographs from the march, that many of the women dressed in costume or had these like very, elaborate, Grecian outfits, or wearing, ivy in their hair, or there were women with washboards with slogans on them. In my mind, originally, I imagined the march just as you had described, with people in hats and the white, blouse and the long skirt, when we think of a suffragette with the banner across their chest. And I thought it would be very staid how it appeared. But there were people on, in all sorts of colorful, creative costumes that really surprised me. It wasn't something I expected to see.
So actually, one thing I'm just going to interrupt to show you this amazing map that's in the book, which is the map of the parade route. And what's amazing and fabulous about it is how charming it is, and the call outs, and also the fact that this is all still there. This whole area of New York has barely changed. You can walk this parade route and see everything that these women saw in 1915, which is really very exciting. So there's a little piece of it that's actually what makes up the cartoon on the cover. So I think, Fiona, I'll ask you this question and then ask Chris the next question. In your imagination, do you visualize all the characters in the parade?
Oh, definitely. I think you have to. It's almost like when you're coming up with a story, whether it's a short story or a novel, I always start with the character, and I need to find a photograph of someone who I think resembles that character, because somehow that makes it three-dimensional to me. And I often go to movie stars or, people who I think, like my last book, I had Emily Blunt and her husband, who's the name I'm thinking of.
Mark Krasinski?
Yes. So they were the lead couple in the book. And
oh, I love the last book, and now I have to rethink the whole book with them.
But so with this, because Alpha Vanderbilt Belmont was a real person, I could see these photos of her, and she was, dressed in the most fine clothes and silks, and lots of jewels dripping from her neck. But her face was just that of the most determined woman I've ever seen. And it was wonderful to be able to picture her. I had a picture up as I was writing.
She either looked like a bulldog or was actually called a bulldog. I don't remember which you said.
Many people said she resembled a bulldog.
Yeah, and she did. So people would like, Chris, what sources did you use for your research?
Well, come with me too.
I'm glad I asked the right question to the right person.
If you look at that shelf carefully, you will see it is a font of information about the Armenian genocide, including Zabel signs in the ruins about the Adana massacre of 1909. That was for the Armenian part of Just Politics. For the 1915 October 23rd march up Fifth Avenue, I went to the source that, well, is the source of all things good and terrible, Google.
I thought you were going to say the New York Times.
That's what I thought he was going to say.
No, I'm talking about the New York Times machine. And as a matter of fact, I am sure I looked at a lot of New York Times time machine articles, but just like Alyson, I was so fascinated by the images I saw of the march, and the ones that struck me the most, I guess, because at the time I didn't have a dog, I didn't have my own Fuzzle, you know, now got Jessie the Wonder Dog, were the images of some of the suffragettes with their dogs. That was one of the images that struck me in the same way that Alyson was struck by the idea that the suffragettes weren't all wearing white.
I love the women on the horses too, and the women who brought the baby carriages. That was great. So somebody asked for the link to the video that I mentioned, and I don't have it, but if you just Google New York 1911 video, I think that you'll find it. I just can't work on the computer while I'm doing this, so I'm afraid I'll like cut you all out. So I think the last thing that I'll ask everybody is to mention, other than our books, another book to recommend as really great quarantine reading. So I'll mention, so not written by any of us, because of course you should all buy all of our books. So another book that I'll mention is a book, oh my God, somebody else, Beatrice Williams, Her Last Flight, was completely captivating and totally took my mind out of the here and now into a really well-imagined book that's sort of like based on Amelia Earhart, but isn't her at all, and was really a fabulous book. And I listened to it on audio, and it was really well done. Fiona, do you want to recommend a book?
Yeah, I just finished The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue.
Oh, everybody's talking about that book.
I'm upset.
Allison called me today to tell me I had to get that book.
I'm so glad I got to go first so I could say it.
Allison's going to have to really figure out something else.
It's a long book, which is why it's great for quarantine reading, but you just fly through it. It's beautifully written. V.E. Schwab is the writer. And it's just a concept that she's created that I've never read about or heard before. And she just takes it and runs with it. It's fantastic.
Well, you have to buy The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. I feel that this is the book that I am going to buy everyone for the holidays. It's one
You're
of
not going to buy everybody Suffragette City?
I guess I will buy them two books.
Okay.
And these
Good recovery,
Addie
Alyson.
LaRue.
Well done.
I'm gonna buy more than one book for everybody. So I'm trying to think. I think another beautiful book that I would love to recommend is The Last Romantics by Tara Conklin. I think that's a really beautiful book. That the writing also is just, it reads like a long poem, and I think it's beautiful. And it's just, I'm not being very articulate because Fiona stole my idea of Addie LaRue, but it's a beautiful book by Tara Conklin, and I recommend that as well.
And Chris, your recommendation?
Okay, here are a couple that I've just loved or I'm loving right now. Rumen Almond's Leave the World Behind.
Yeah.
It is just dread, and it's fantastic. And then you read a chapter of that, and then read a few pages of, and my daughter gave me this book and I just love it, Jerry Seinfeld's Is This Anything?
I think I'm going to get that one. I need happiness.
It's monologues going back to the 1970s, and they're great. And you hear Jerry's voice. Tana French's The Searcher. I mean, Tana French can do no wrong, and The Searcher is really good. And I think every sentient person in America has already read it, but if you haven't, Britt Bennett's The Vanishing Half.
I love The Mothers. I haven't read her new one yet, so I actually have to get that and read that because everyone is saying it's wonderful. I love her writing.
Writes me in all the best ways.
So I just want to thank everybody for coming, all of our authors and all of the wonderful participants. And just for the last time, please buy books from Foxtail Books and any other and every other independent that's in your local area, because we really need to support bookstores now in this terrible time, because that's where we find and browse and discover our great next read. Thank you all so much for coming. And I
Great.
hope you've all voted and that you stay safe and healthy. You want to say
Thank you,
something,
MJ.
Chris?
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you too
Oh,
for
thank
you so
you.
much for
Thank you.
everyone
your book
listening us,
goddesses.
reading
Thank
this.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for hosting us.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Oh.
Oh,
Good night, everybody.
Night. Thank you.